Day 1 at the lake, Australian winter, our stunt actress in the water. 20 minutes later, we pull her out and she's borderline hypothermic. I hadn't asked the right questions before the shoot. That one was entirely on me. That same week, I put 5 blow-up sex dolls in the lake to fake dead bodies. They didn't look like dead bodies at all. They looked like floating plastic waste. Completely unusable. I tested nothing before the shoot. I'm running all of this on 1 month of rest after finishing a project that will hit 2.5 million views. Here's everything that led to that moment. The 42-minute film is called I Do Not Recognize the Bodies in the Water. I made it immediately after finishing the original Anti-Memetics division, which you can watch the behind the scenes video probably around here. But instead of taking a real break, I gave myself just 1 month and went straight into pre-production on this one. The reason was practical. I was moving back to Italy in August and that was my hard deadline. If I didn't make this film before I left, I wasn't making it at all. So the timeline forced a decision, which is good if you are a procrastinator like me. I Do Not Recognize Bodies in the Water is adapted from a piece of interactive fiction with a significant online following called the SCP Foundation, if you don't know. The premise is a malevolent body of water that lures victims to their death by projecting the illusion of their drowning loved ones. And what I wanted to build around that source material was different from what most people expected. I wasn't interested in making just a fan film. I wanted to make something that felt like an episode of a show, like a X-Files energy, procedural, slow burn, a world that you could return to if you wanted. And that ambition created, obviously, problems that I will get to, but going in fast also meant going in with the lessons from the previous miniseries that I hadn't quite had the time to fully process. 2 lessons specifically, one I got right, one I got completely wrong. On the original Anti-Memetics division, I was the director and effectively the production manager. Everything ran through me. Location negotiations, scheduling, vendor calls, crew communication, all of it. And on top of it, actually, I had to direct. It kind of worked until the final days when it didn't. By the end of that production, I understood one thing very clearly. If I ever did anything like this again, I needed a first AD. For Bodies in the Water, I brought on Matthew. What a first AD does sounds simple. He runs the set so you can focus on the camera and the performance. He calls the crew between setups, manages the entire schedules, handles the 100 small logistical problems that shouldn't be anywhere near your brain when you are 45 minutes from the next shot. What it actually did, it was give me my head back on set. The difference between directing with the first AD and directing without one is the difference between running a production and being run by one. You don't know what you're missing until you have it. If you're directing anything longer than a single day and you don't have a first AD, definitely get one. The second thing is the production designer. We had someone during pre-production on this project. They shaped the visual language and worked through the props, defined the feel of the world, and then they weren't available for the full shoot. I made the call to continue with that one. We had a costume designer, so that side was covered. And the location itself was strong, the bones were there. But what I didn't account for was that a good location doesn't become a set by itself. Someone has to look at it through the lens of the story and ask what it needs to say, what's missing, what needs to be added or moved, removed. Without someone whose specific job that is, the location stays exactly as you found it. You shoot in it instead of with it. And that work defaulted back to me, and I had enough on my hands that I didn't get the attention that it needed. So when you watch the film, you can feel it in certain scenes. The space is present, but it isn't quite working right. It isn't telling you anything beyond what it already was. That's the difference production designer makes, not building elaborate sets, but making sure the world your characters live in is actually designed. Even when the budget is small, especially when the budget is small. That feeling doesn't show up on a budget sheet. It costumes on screen. I asked Fabio about it too, our director of photography.
There's something that I would have done differently, probably was adding or maybe work more on the 70s scenes. It was very hard to find locations that actually looked like that. We managed to find them, but you can still see a bit of modernity in the locations. So I wish we had more time maybe to add more props or maybe add more set design.
That's the confirmation you don't want, but you need. Fabio and I worked through most of the visual strategy for the lake in pre-production. Day for night, the light conditions, the camera setup. What we hadn't fully solved was what the water itself was going to look like with the bodies in it. That problem was still waiting when we arrived at the lake. I talked about not having a production designer for the full shoot. What I didn't mention is that every visual decision that would normally live in a production designer head had to live somewhere, and for me that somewhere is Milanote. Let me show you how I actually use it as a filmmaker. Every project I work on starts as what I call a cold storyboard, a place where the idea lives before it becomes a production. Notes, references, images, early thoughts on the story. Sometimes it's 3 cards, sometimes it's 100. For I Do Not Recognize the Bodies in the Water, I built this out over a couple of months before we shot a single frame. The first thing I do is separate the boards by function, story development, visual language, art department, costumes. Each one is its own board, but they all live inside the same project. I can move between them in seconds. The visual language board is where I spend most of my pre-production time. For Bodies in the Water, I split it into 3 sections. The exterior lake sequences, all the reference that are cold, the saturated, I pull from films and show that have that specific quality of light that doesn't look like it's coming from anywhere in particular. The interior sequence needed something different, slightly warmer, degraded, that 35mm textured without being heavy-handed about it. A lot of Roger Deakins references in there because his work in natural light is exactly what I was going for. And then the 1976 sequence, which are part of the larger story canon, those needed to feel completely distinct, so bright, saturated, almost uncomfortable, in how different they feel from the rest of the film. What Milanote does that nothing else does is let me see all of those references at the same time. When I pull back on the board and I'm looking at all my images arranged by section, I can see the color pattern of the whole film at a glance. The cold exteriors, the warm interiors, the bright 76 material. If something is wrong, if a reference is pulling in the wrong direction, you see it immediately. You don't have to click through folders or scroll through a Pinterest board. It's all there. That's the infinite canvas. You can make it as large as you need and it never gets in your way. The art department board works differently. Here I divide everything by location. The lake gets its own section, inspiration, references alongside the actual location photos from our scout. The houses, the car that we ended up using, where we found it, the visual references that informed the decision. Every location has both the references I was pulling from and the real world material we were working with. It means that when I'm talking to my DOP, Fabio, or my costume designer, Anna, we're working from the same board. The conversation is faster because we are looking at the same things. Speaking of costumes, I built character boards for each major role. The costume designer on this film was excellent, and part of why it worked is that the brief I gave her was visual, not a paragraph of descriptions or a website. It was a board of images with notes, and she could see exactly what I meant. And what we ended up shooting was very close to what it's on the board. Beyond the visual work, Milanote handles documents, PDF, scripts, links, and now tables, which means I can put the budget and the shoot schedule directly inside the project so everything lives in one place. I've built templates for the writing stage that I now just drop into every new project at the start. And just as another example, I'm gonna show you the board that I made for There Is No Anti-Medics division, because it's very similar. I divided into different episodes here as well. You have a production design board with all the location that we were looking for. You got the scout images, you got the details that got added by the production designer. You can see how we were looking for our own Marion Wheeler, so you have all the casting. You have all the inspiration material that I share with the production designer, obviously very much inspired by Control, as you know, I love it. But this was the foundation to build out the world, not only for Anti-Medics division, but also for Bodies in the Water. The free plan gets you started with 100 notes, 10 file uploads, full Canva access. The pay plan removes those limits and lets you share the boards with your full team. If you are in pre-production right now on a movie or a creative project, you should definitely check out Milanote. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Getting to the lake took 45 minutes. Getting the permission to film there took a bit longer, and then we needed a council permit, a first aid officer on set, a generator to run heater and changing tent because our actors were going into the water in July, Australian winter. The sun in Melbourne in July is still strong enough that it doesn't feel cold until you stop moving, and then it finds you. So we had scouted the location and we knew the light, the access points, where to park. Me and Fabio thought we were prepared to shoot. He remembers that slightly different.
Well, the first thing that I remember when arriving on the lake was definitely what kind of issue, the problem, mostly logistically, what would be the best scenario and the workflow. And my main concern was, of course, the wind, the weather, because most of the shoot was weather reliances. The countryside of Australia in winter, it's very windy and cold.
He was right to worry. The first scene we shot proved it.
The harshest condition during the shoot, I think, was the initial scene, because it was very sunny. You didn't have much to move around because it was very windy. We ended up using a polyboard, but yeah, I think that was just the harshest condition we shot.
A polyboard, that's it. That's the entire solution to a problem that could have cost us, the whole sequence. But sometimes the fix isn't that complicated. It just has to be the correct one. The day for night decision had been made in pre-production, and in the film, the final lake sequence happens at night, but we were not going to shoot at night. The safety risk was too high and the light control was impossible on our budget. So we made the call early. We shoot in daylight and then do day for night in post with grading.
So when Andrea decided to shoot day for night, can be done, no problem. The only issue was indeed there was the timing during the day. So first of all, you hope that it's cloudy, and usually you tend to shoot in the warmer period of the day, which usually goes between 2 and 3 in the afternoon.
That's a real production compromise. It costs you something on screen, obviously, and natural darkness has a texture that graded darkness doesn't quite replicate, but it was the right call. When you're asking actors to get into freezing water, you make the environment as controlled as you can. You don't add like pitch black to the equation. The broader lesson is, if you're going to take a hit on screen, decide that consciously and early. Decide that in pre-production, not on the day because you didn't want to have that conversation. The compromise that hurts you most in production are the one nobody discusses before the shooting started. We had the permit, the generator, the tent, the first aid officer. We had thought through most of it. The first major water sequence involved 2 actors, a mother and a child. The mother was played by a stunt performer. Before the shoot, I asked if she was comfortable jumping in the water, and obviously she said yes. But what I didn't ask was her specific history with water. What I didn't do was sit down with her before the shoot and walk through what the condition will actually be, the temperature, the weight of the wet costume, and how long we'll need her in there in the water. The issue was that she had a near drowning experience earlier in her life. She was afraid of water and she had told herself she could push through it, and she wanted to do it, but there was a miscommunication somewhere between wardrobe, the first aid officers, and myself about what she was wearing under her costumes. She didn't have enough insulation for the temperature of the water, so she went in and she wanted to get the shot. She was pushing for before. She kept going. But 20 minutes in, our first aid officer made a call to end the take and pull her out. And I wasn't the only one realizing that was happening.
They did great. Can't believe how well they did in those conditions. The water was freezing. But yeah, my concern was they need to get warm as fast as possible because, you can risk hypothermia. We had everything ready. We had the blankets, we have electric heater, we had everything ready. My concern was mostly, hopefully they're fine.
She was fine. She was back the next day. She said she wanted to finish. But standing in that lake watching our first aid officer work, I understood something clearly about pre-production conversations. The conversation about physical requirements belongs before the shoot. Not on the day, not standing next to a freezing lake at 10 a.m. In casting or in your first production meeting with the actor, what are you asking them to do physically should be at the forefront. What is their history with it? What condition will they actually be working in specifically? If that conversation feels awkward, have it anyway. What comes after if you don't do it is far worse. But the funny thing was that the kid was completely fine, and I still don't know how. Now, the bodies. I needed figures floating face down in the water. Background elements visible enough to register, but close enough to unsettle. My solution was 5 blow-up sex dolls, dressed, wigged, and placed in the water. And that was a terrible idea. The blow-up sex dolls are not human size. They run closer to 140, 150 centimeters. And when they float in a way a body doesn't. And they have a wrong proportion, a wrong silhouette. In that lake, they look like children floating face down, which was not the effect I was going for. I had not tested this before the shoot, and I had imagined that it just worked. And I hadn't not put one in a bathtub or a pool or any body of water to check what it actually looked like. I show up with 5 of them in a bag and put them in the lake. Test your practical effects before you shoot, with enough time left to find a different solution when they don't work. This is not a complicated lesson. I had to learn in front of my entire crew on day one. We cut most of those shots, and what we kept, Fabio and I tried to save in the grade may help, but not enough. Later in the shoot, the actors playing the teenagers went into the water, and we ran 2 cameras for those sequences specifically. The logic was simple: get them in, get the coverage, get them out. No time for multiple takes. The call doesn't really care about your shot list.
So when we finally approached the scenes where they are in the lake, Andrea and I made the call to use 2 cameras. It's mostly because putting people in freezing water, we just need to get as much coverage, as angles as possible. We didn't have much time to rehearsal or no, let's try it again. It was very straightforward, and eventually it worked out fine.
If you watch the film, you can see them shivering between the cuts, and we didn't hide it. We didn't have time to do it. What we made at that lake in those conditions, I'm actually proud of. The performances in the water are real, and that cold was real. You cannot manufacture that. The film was done, and then it went out into the world. I do not recognize the bodies in the water came after There Is No Anti-Medics had crossed 2.2 million views. The channel had momentum and the audience was there, but right now it sits at 120,000 views. I thought about that gap a lot. Some of it obviously comes down to the story. Anti-Medics is a very, very famous SCP story and a very famous book. Bodies in the Water is more of a slow burn, procedural. Those are the films I love. The Outsider, True Detective, Mike Flanagan's work, episodes that take their time. That mismatch, it's conscious, but I don't regret it. But I understand now that the algorithm rewards speed and velocity and momentum. The other thing I'll change is how much the work behind the film feels present in it, especially the foundation. The source material has a large specific audience that wants to feel the institution, the bureaucracy, the procedures, the logic of the larger world operating around the horror. In Bodies in the Water, that layer is a big thing. You feel the lake, you don't quite feel everything behind it. That's a writing decision, not a production one. The kind of thing you only see clearly from a distance when the film is done. Here's what I'll tell filmmakers watching this. The momentum decision was right. Going straight from one production into the next one kept me sharp, kept the core crew together, kept the institutional knowledge alive. If I had taken 6 months off between them, I have lost something real. But momentum and recovery are not the same thing. By the end of the shoot, I was depleted in a way that took a long time to climb out of it. And you can make good work in that state. You probably cannot make your best work. And there is a version of sustainable production pace I hadn't figured out yet, and I paid for it afterward. The gap between 2.8 million and 120,000 views is real. It's informative about the audience and about the format, about the story that you're making, what people want and what they're expecting from you. Every film teaches you something that the next one needs. If you're building towards your first film, I put together everything I wish I had before I made this. The pre-production decision, the budget frameworks, the things nobody tells you until you're standing next to a frozen lake. It's free. It's called the Committed Filmmaker Starter Kit, and you can find it in the link below.